as Rachel outlined, the performance, of the United States on civilian harm in these more contemporary conflicts is uneven and reveals really concerning gaps. And so the question is, how do we truly institutionalize the lessons that have been drawn from the experience in Afghanistan? First and foremost, what we would propose and recommend is the adoption of a uniform policy on civilian protection. This policy would cover all U.S. operations worldwide. This policy would also standardize the methodology by which the United States tracks, monitors, and defines civilian harm in all of its operations, and standardize its post-incident response. So improving its transparency in terms of public information after incidents of harm, as well as amends, and standardize the provision of amends when and how those policies are implemented. Secondly, this policy would integrate all U.S. efforts, particularly within and between State Department and DoD, within which have a multiplicity of actors with different lines of responsibility and authorities. And a policy like this would set out a common vision and clear lines of responsibility to organize and much better coordinate those efforts. Secondly, how would we make this policy an operational reality? What we would propose is the creation of civilian protection cells modeled after what ISAF created around 2009 with the Civilian Casualty Mitigation Team, but this time made standing and permanent. We would also recommend that those cells be made real at 3 distinct levels. Firstly, at the operational headquarters level, which would allow for the collection of data and the analysis of information that would be truly responsive to commanders' needs on the ground. Secondly, at a combatant command level, which would be especially helpful and constructive in managing U.S. military partners, relationship with partners, and assistance to security forces. And finally, at the Joint Chiefs level, which we think would be instrumental in ensuring that lessons learned are discerned across services and pushed out throughout U.S. military forces. So what would the civilian protection cells do? Well, I think there's two areas in particular, again, drawing from the experience in Afghanistan. Number one, collecting data. And this means not just gross numbers of fatalities, but actually disaggregating the causes of civilian harm. For instance, the use of close air support in populated areas in Afghanistan, or trends on escalation of force incidents in Afghanistan. And this would also allow the U.S. military to broaden its ambit of information to include very relevant and critically important factors around civilian harm, such as displacement, access to services, economic insecurity, and also draw on information from civil society and international organizations, as well as open sources in a much more rigorous and standardized way, which we think would also be particularly important in contexts where the United States doesn't have the kinds of boots on the grounds that it did in places like Afghanistan in years past. Secondly, and critically, analysis. One of the things that the Civilian Casualty Mitigation Team in ISAF did was not just tabulate numbers, but it was to dive down into that information and analyze it to identify trends, identify drivers, and based on that, make recommendations that were specifically tailored to the tactical and operational realities that commanders were facing in order to produce real gains in terms of civilian harm mitigation. And so it's this latter piece, this combination of data and analysis that we think is important to allow for that feedback to enable commanders to have the information so that they can learn how to conduct operations better and in a more strategically sound way. Finally, we advocate for ensuring that this policy extends to U.S. partner forces. Partner forces whom, as Rachel mentioned, whose legitimacy is increasingly critical to U.S. strategic objectives around the world. In Afghanistan, as Rachel mentioned again with ANSF, it's clear that a lot of efforts were too little, too late. And so from that, we think that it's incredibly important that from the beginning, POC and protection of civilian is built into partner training and support strategies, and that's integrated across DoD and State Department in all U.S. efforts. In particular, when it comes to training and also leadership relationships, commander-to-commander relationships, making sure that protection of civilians is not just a legal nicety, that we are clear that this is critical not only to our partners' success, but also to U.S. strategic objectives and to further assistance and support. And finally, drawing on the experience of data and analysis, ensuring that in areas where the United States is engaging deeply with partners, that its own data and analysis captures its performance of partners, and that it transfers that capability over to partners so that they, over time, may use that information to develop their own tactical and operational reforms. So finally, I think when we step back at a fundamental level, a lot of the recommendations and drawing on the lessons that have been discerned are really about improving our knowledge. It's about getting data. Right now, we don't know what we don't know. And I think we're also very realistic that recommendations such as new protection cells in a climate of flat or declining budgets may come up against certain headwinds. But I think what we would stress is that this is really something that's practically possible, would be a fraction of the cost of what the U.S. spends in operations in Iraq, Syria, and to assistance to partner forces, and would really be a low-cost, very high payoff way for the United States to address these new threats and the new reality of the strategic cost and threat that civilian harm poses to its operations throughout the world. So, thanks very much.